We know we're about 6 months out from the next election. And as President Biden campaigns for another term, he seems desperate to convince the American people that America's economic troubles aren't his fault and are somehow a figment of their imagination. Last week, he said inflation was at 9% when I came in, and now it's down to 3%. This marked the second time in only a handful of days that the president made this claim, and it would be great if it were true. The fact is, under President Biden's economic policies, inflation has reached a 40-year high and is stubbornly resisting efforts by the Federal Reserve to bring it down. In reality, inflation was at only 1.4% when President Biden took office. And under his leadership, Washington Democrats went on a crazy spending spree that sent inflation skyrocketing to the highest in 40 years. I know we're all familiar with the Federal Reserve and its role to try to bring down inflation by making money tighter, and they do that by raising interest rates. But that's not without a cost. And the ability of hardworking Texas families and other Americans to buy a car, buy a house, obviously those have been negatively impacted. And if you went to the grocery store and filled up a basket of groceries the day that President Biden took office and then did it again recently, you'll see that your grocery prices went up 36%. Thanks to President Biden's policies. And mainly what that is, it's not about the Federal Reserve, it's about all the spending that our Democratic colleagues have done here, about $2.7 trillion of partisan spending bills, which are like gasoline on the inflation fire. Finally, as a result of tight money policies by the Federal Reserve, inflation has cooled somewhat, but prices remain unbearably high for most families, and inflation is still more than double what it was when President Biden took office. This may be the president's latest attempt to try to divert attention and misrepresent his record, but it certainly isn't the only one. Last month, the president tweeted this. He said, Donald Trump was very proud of his $2 trillion tax cut that overwhelmingly benefited the wealthy and biggest corporations and exploded the federal debt. That tax cut is going to expire. If I'm reelected, it's going to stay expired. Well, forget for a minute that President Biden has misrepresented who benefited from the tax cut and bringing more foreign investment back to the United States by bringing our corporate and business tax rates in line with other democracies around the world. As a matter of fact, before COVID, the economy was about the best it's ever been in my adult lifetime, because the economy was roaring back in part because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act bill that we passed in 2017. First, this is an interesting time for the president to start paying attention to the national debt, something he's forgotten about entirely for the last 3.5 years. And on his watch, our national debt is now approaching $35 trillion. As I said, he and congressional Democrats spent nearly $2.7 trillion in less than 18 months on things like handouts for union bosses and money for something they called climate justice, whatever that is. But apparently tax relief for working families is where he draws the line. But the second issue that I can't ignore is this. Allowing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to expire would raise taxes on virtually everybody, including working families. The Wall Street Journal recently took a look at this. This was 10 days ago, May the 10th. They looked at data from the Tax Foundation and determined that, quote, if the tax cuts expire, which is something that President Biden said he would see to, about 62% of households would pay more, 9% would pay less, and the rest would be largely unaffected, according to the Tax Foundation, as I said. So, based on President Biden's tweet that he would let the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expire, 62% of households in America would pay more taxes. Given the financial pain, mainly caused by inflation, that families are already feeling, a larger tax burden is the very last thing American families need. But that seems to be the path on which President Biden is headed. And it would be salt in the wound for the families who are already struggling to cover their basic living expenses, like that basket of groceries that's cost 36% more now than it did 3.5 years ago. Another thing to note is that this would actually break President Biden's marquee promise to never raise taxes on households making under $400,000 a year. Once that was pointed out, the president's team quickly shifted into damage control and said, well, the president really doesn't want all of this law to expire, just the portions that affect people making more than $400,000 a year. But it's hard to know whether the president is coming or going when he makes these statements. And every time you take him at his word, his political team comes in and does cleanup and says, no, he really didn't mean that. But the president already made his statement in the clearest of possible terms. The tax cut will expire unless extended, and if he's elected, he said it will stay expired, raising taxes on 62% of households. Of course, it's no surprise that President Biden would allow tax increases on working families. After all, during his presidency, it has been defined by giveaways for unlikely winners. First, there's the handouts for wealthy electric vehicle purchasers. The horribly misnamed Inflation Reduction Act included massive handouts for some of the most expensive vehicles on the market, vehicles that many Americans cannot simply afford, yet they are being asked to subsidize rich people getting fancy new electric vehicles. Wealthy Americans earning hundreds of thousands of dollars a year can receive up to $7,500 in taxpayer assistance to buy an electric vehicle, including those made in China. Democrats passed this bill at a time when many people couldn't and still can't afford basic expenses. Democrats responded by forcing every person in America to subsidize expensive electric vehicles for well-to-do people. The initial estimate pegged the cost of these EV tax credits at just over $30 billion. $30 billion. But private forecasters later released an updated estimate which found that the actual cost of these electric vehicle tax credits is more than $196 billion, 6.5 times higher than advertised. Of course, hardworking families are the ones footing the bill for these tax credits, which disproportionately benefit wealthy people. Then there's the president's attempt to, quote, cancel student debt for millions of borrowers. Now, his administration has offered multiple plans to wipe away loans for millions of borrowers and stick taxpayers with the bill. The Supreme Court told him he couldn't, and he went back to the drawing board and figured a way to go ahead and do it. To state the obvious, the vast majority of Americans don't benefit from that, 87% of Americans do not have outstanding student loan debt. So the 87% are going to pay for the 13% who do. Many people decided not to go to college, either because they couldn't afford it or because they pursued some other course of study. Many worked while pursuing a degree. Many paid off their loans after graduating, just as they agreed to do. Still, President Biden expects that every single person without college debt to shoulder the cost for someone else's degree. This is, after fact, something they agreed to do by contract, to pay that money back. His student debt cancellation plan would cost taxpayers $475 billion, even though only 13% of Americans reap the benefits. The new plans he rolled out earlier this year would cost an additional $84 billion. It is fundamentally unfair to expect taxpayers with no student loan debt to pay for someone else's degree, especially when that person agreed to pay it back. Madam President, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which President Biden wants to see expire, isn't the problem. This law puts money back in the pockets of hardworking Texans by allowing workers to keep more of what they earn. See, that's the problem here in Washington, D.C. So many bureaucrats and insiders think that the money that you earn is actually what you are allowed to keep by the government, because it's really all the government's, and the government just allows you to keep some of it. Well, they have it exactly backward. It's the money of the people who earn it, and the people who earn it pay their taxes as they're required to do so. But it's their money, and every dollar of a tax increase that Washington orders is $1 less in their pocket to spend on their family. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act gave tax relief to small businesses and job creators, unleashing a wave of economic growth. And it encouraged companies who had invested their money abroad to bring that money back home and build new businesses or expand their businesses here and not overseas. After this bill became law, unemployment decreased, wages increased, and communities across America experienced a wave of economic success. Unfortunately, the pandemic threw a wrench into our humming economy, and then President Biden came along with a sledgehammer, seemingly determined to destroy every economic gain we made under President Trump. His policy has ushered in the worst inflation in 40 years, and as a result, hardworking families are struggling to make ends meet. The cost of groceries, gas, rent have skyrocketed, while household incomes remain anemic. Many Americans who've been scrimping and saving for years in order to buy a home have had to keep that dream on hold because of high interest rates. And now the president seems intent on allowing the 2017 tax cuts to expire, ensuring that millions more of Americans will pay more in taxes. If President Biden manages to win another term in the White House, I worry about how much more economic pain he will inflict on families. Inflation is up, interest rates are up, and according to President Biden, another term in office for him means your taxes will go up too. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I would note the absence of a quorum.